Margaret woke early on her 68th birthday. She boiled tea, set one cup on the table for habit, then put it back in the cabinet. The house was quiet. Dust floated in a thin beam of winter light. She stood there a moment, palms flat on the counter, telling herself this year would be different. This year she would not spend the day alone. She took the bus to the bakery and chose a small cake with white frosting and a simple border. She asked the girl behind the counter to write in careful blue letters, "Happy birthday, Mom." The girl smiled and said it looked sweet. Margaret smiled back, though her hands trembled a little as she counted the notes from her purse. The cake was not expensive, but every bill she spent reminded her that she was careful now, that she stretched her pension the way she once stretched a pot of soup for a growing child. In her bag she carried a wrapped box, a silver locket she had saved for. Inside the locket she placed 2 tiny photos, one of Clara at 6 months, mouth open like a little bird, and one of Margaret holding her on the day she learned to walk. She had picked the locket because Clara always loved small, shiny things as a girl. She pictured Clara's face softening, the way it used to when she got a surprise. Maybe Margaret thought the locket would pull them back to that time when love was simple and loud and daily. On the bus ride, she rehearsed what she would say. Nothing dramatic. No blame. She would say, "I missed you, and I'm proud of you, and I'm sorry for whatever I did that made you feel far." She would not mention Daniel. She would not mention the last argument about money, or how Clara had stopped visiting after that. She would keep the day light. A birthday is for peace, she told herself. When she reached Clara's street, gray clouds moved over the roofs like slow ships. The wind cut through her coat. She held the cake box tight and walked carefully so it wouldn't tilt. From the sidewalk she could see the lights on in Clara's house, warm pools of gold against the glass. Music drifted out, the low kind people play when they cook. For a second, hope surged so fast it made her dizzy. Maybe they had planned something and simply forgot to tell her. Maybe there would be a chair for her at the table, a laugh, a candle to blow out with her daughter's hands around hers. She rang the bell. Footsteps. The lock clicked. The door opened to Clara's face, older than the last picture on Margaret's mantel, sharper, beautiful in the way hard stone is beautiful. Behind her, Margaret saw a table set for 2 plates. She smelled roasted chicken and herbs. She also saw Daniel in the kitchen, leaning on the counter, watching his phone, jaw tight. "Hey," Margaret said softly, lifting the cake an inch like a greeting. Surprise. Clara didn't move. Her eyes went first to the cake, then to the gift bag, then to her mother's face. A shadow crossed her expression. "Mom," she said, not warm, not cold, just flat. "What are you doing here?" "It's my birthday," Margaret said with a tiny laugh that tried to be brave. "I thought maybe we could have tea and a slice." Daniel looked up. "We're busy," he called, still not coming to the door. "We have plans." Clara took a breath, the kind people take before they say something sharp. "Why are you here?" she said louder now. "We don't need you anymore." Margaret's mouth opened. No sound came. The words landed on her like cold water. She stood frozen, cake box hovering between them, blue icing letters shaking slightly with her hands. I didn't know," she said at last. "I should have called." "You should have," Clara answered. Her eyes flicked again to the box. "We don't have space for this. We don't have space for drama." "It's just a cake," Margaret whispered. Daniel walked to the door then, not close, just near enough to be felt like a wall at Clara's back. "She said we're busy," he said. "We asked you before to give us some space. Did you forget?" Margaret swallowed. She wanted to step forward, to hand the cake to her daughter and say, "Look, it's small. It will only take 10 minutes. We can pretend we are happy for 10 minutes. Instead, she tried one more time. "I brought a little gift," she said. "Something from the old days." Clara stared at the box and something hard slid into her face, a mask that fit too well. "We don't need anything from the old days," she said. Then, with a quick, tired motion, as if swatting a fly, she pressed her palm against the cake box and pushed it down. The box slipped from Margaret's fingers, hit the step, and opened. White frosting smeared across the cold concrete. The blue letters broke. The small plastic candle rolled into the flower bed and disappeared under wet leaves. For a second, nobody moved. Even the music inside seemed to pause. Margaret stared at the ruined cake and felt a strange calm pass through her, the kind that comes when pain is too sharp to feel. She bent, as if to clean it, but her knees wouldn't hold. "Please go," Clara said. Her voice wavered now, but she didn't bend to help. "Just go, okay?" The door clicked shut. Margaret stayed on the step. The wind lifted a corner of the box and smacked it gently against her shoe. Someone across the street closed curtains. The smell of roasted chicken turned her stomach. She looked at her hands. Frosting streaked her gloves like chalk. She did not knock again. She did not call out. She picked up the gift bag, brushed off a leaf, and tucked it under her arm. Then she knelt, found the small candle in the flower bed by touch, and slipped it into her pocket as if saving a tiny piece of the day that might still be hers. She walked to the bus stop slowly, heels tapping the pavement in a rhythm that kept her upright. The bus shelter metal was cold against her back. She watched cars pass and thought of all the birthdays behind her. Paper hats, cheap candles, Clara clapping with cake on her cheeks. The year she worked a double shift and still came home to wrap a doll in newspaper because that's what she could afford. She thought of the nights she stood in doorways listening to Clara breathe, counting the breaths like prayers, promising herself she would be enough for 2 parents. Her phone buzzed once. A message from the bakery. "Hope you enjoyed your cake." She smiled without humor and turned the phone face down on her lap. When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard and sat by the window. City lights smeared into thin lines as they moved past. She took the locket from the bag and opened it. The hinge made a small click. There were the faces she knew better than the back of her own hand. Clara's baby eyes looked up at her, trusting, forever 6 months old. Margaret closed the locket and pressed it to her chest. At home, she set the gift on the table and washed the frosting from her gloves. She made tea she could not taste. After a while, she carried a trash bag to the sink and gently laid the cake-stained napkins inside, each one folded as neatly as linens for a guest who did not come. She stopped in the hallway by a shoebox of papers. Inside were paid bills, a few letters, and an old business card from a lawyer who once helped her with a small property dispute after her husband died. She touched the card, then pulled back. Not tonight, she told herself. Not from anger. Not when my hands are shaking. She turned off lights, one room at a time, until only the lamp by the couch remained. On the coffee table, she placed the candle she had rescued from the flower bed. She lit it. The flame was small and steady. Margaret watched it burn and felt the room breathe with her. She was alone, yes, but she was not nothing. When the candle melted to a silver pool and went out with a soft sigh, she whispered into the dark, almost like a prayer and almost like a promise. No more begging for love. Then she went to bed, eyes open, the silence of the slammed door echoing in the hallway, already hardening into the kind of memory that changes a life. Margaret sat at her kitchen table long after the sky had gone black. The street outside her window was empty, a thin mist rising off the pavement under the yellow streetlight. She hadn't turned on the overhead light, only the small lamp above the sink. It gave the room a half-lit glow, casting long shadows across the counter where her teacup sat untouched. Her coat still hung on the chair, dusted faintly with crumbs from the ruined cake. She had been too tired to brush them off. The scent of frosting lingered in her gloves, sweet and heavy, and every time she raised her hands she smelled the memory of her daughter's words. "We don't need you anymore." Margaret pressed her palms flat on the table. They were trembling. She wanted to believe it had been a mistake, that Clara hadn't meant it, that Daniel's voice had pushed her into saying something cruel. But the slam of the door had not been an accident. That sound still rang in Margaret's ears, a final note that no apology could cover. She poured herself tea, but her hands shook so much the hot liquid spilled over the rim of the cup and onto her sleeve. She didn't care. She left the cup steaming beside her and leaned her head into her hands. Tears fell silently, one after another, until her sleeve was damp. She wasn't sobbing or wailing, just leaking grief, as if her body could no longer hold it inside. The clock ticked slowly, each second a reminder of the emptiness in the house. For decades, she had filled birthdays with balloons, songs, and small surprises for her daughter. Even when money was scarce, she'd made something special. A second-hand doll wrapped in brown paper, a cake she baked herself with sugar stretched to the last spoonful. Clara's laughter back then had been the only gift Margaret needed. But tonight, in the silence, Margaret felt every sacrifice she had made crash down on her. She had worked double shifts, mended her own shoes to afford Clara's new ones, endured loneliness after her husband died, all for a daughter who now saw her as a burden. She lifted her head and whispered to the empty room, "I gave you everything." Her voice cracked, swallowed quickly by silence. For a long while, she sat still, staring at the candle she had rescued from the flower bed earlier. It lay on the counter, slightly bent, still with frosting clinging to its side. She picked it up and rolled it between her fingers. A single candle, meant to bring joy, had ended up in the dirt. How perfectly it mirrored her place in her daughter's life. But Margaret was not weak, and she knew it. Slowly, she straightened her back, wiping her cheeks with the edge of her sleeve. She wasn't the kind of woman who begged for love. She had endured too much in her life to collapse completely. There was still strength inside her, quiet, steady strength that no cruel word could erase. She pushed the cold tea away and reached for the shoebox on the shelf. Inside were old documents, bills, a few photographs, and a business card tucked in the corner. She slid it out and stared at the name. Henry C. Lang, attorney at law. Years ago, he had helped her resolve a property dispute after her husband's passing. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but she remembered the way he had looked at her. Not with pity, but with respect. Margaret set the card on the table and placed her hand over it. Her mind was clear now. If her daughter could slam the door on her birthday, what would stop her from abandoning her completely in the years ahead? Clara had made her feelings clear. She didn't need her mother anymore. Margaret whispered again, this time stronger. Then you don't need what I leave behind. The words surprised her. They didn't sound bitter. They sounded firm, final, like a decision that had been waiting to be made. She stood up and moved through the house, switching off the few lights she had left on. In her bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the locket again, opening it to see Clara's baby face and her own younger smile. For a moment, her chest ached with love, a raw pull that nearly undid her resolve. She brushed her finger over Clara's picture. I loved you enough for 2 parents, she whispered. But love is not chains. She closed the locket, placed it back in the box, and turned out the light. The night passed slowly. Margaret lay awake, replaying the scene at the doorway again and again. The cake hitting the ground, the door slamming, her daughter's cold voice. But each time she replayed it, the pain turned into something steadier, something colder. By dawn, she had made her choice. When the first light touched her curtains, she rose, dressed, and placed the attorney's card into her purse. Her steps were calm, not rushed. She walked to the phone in the hallway, lifted the receiver, and dialed the number she had memorized from years ago. Henry Lang's office, a voice answered. This is Margaret Wilson, she said, her voice steady. I need an appointment. It's urgent. By the time she hung up, the tears were gone. Her face was pale but composed. She boiled water for fresh tea and set the table for one, this time with a single slice of bread and butter. She ate slowly, each bite deliberate, as though she were reclaiming control over her life one small act at a time. The day had begun, and with it, the end of Clara's place in her will. Margaret did not feel joy or triumph. What she felt was stronger, a calm dignity, the kind that comes when a person finally stops asking to be loved and instead chooses to love themselves. She washed her cup, dried it carefully, and set it back in the cabinet. The house was quiet, but no longer heavy. She knew what she had to do. And in her heart, she also knew, when Clara realized what she had lost, the silence of her mother's decision would echo louder than any argument ever could. The morning air was cool and sharp, the kind that made every sound ring louder than it should. Margaret sat by the window with her teacup, the steam rising into the quiet room. She had not slept much, but she felt strangely calm. The papers she signed the day before lay neatly in a folder on the table. One phone call, one firm decision, and her life had shifted. Clara was no longer her heir. It hadn't been easy. When Margaret told Mr. Lang, her attorney, what she wanted, he paused. Are you sure? He asked gently. This is permanent. I am, Margaret replied. Her voice did not tremble. I want everything to go to Adam. He has always respected me, always treated me like family. The documents were drawn, signed, and sealed. Margaret left the office feeling both hollow and light, like a bird who had flown from its cage, but wasn't sure where to land. She returned home, fixed herself a modest dinner, and then sat in the stillness, waiting for the storm she knew would come. And it did. By morning, the news had spread. Adam, overwhelmed with gratitude, had posted a photo online of the two of them together from last Christmas. In his caption he wrote, My Aunt Margaret has always been like a second mother to me. I am honored that she trusts me with her estate. I will make sure her love and sacrifices are never forgotten. It wasn't long before Clara saw it. At first, Margaret's phone began to buzz with calls. She glanced at the screen. Clara. The first call she ignored. Then came the second, then the third. By the time the fifth call rang through, Margaret muted her phone and placed it face down on the table. Not even an hour later, there was pounding on the door. Hard, desperate knocks that rattled the frame. "Mom!" Clara's voice carried through the wood, high and panicked. "Mom, open the door. Please, we need to talk." Margaret did not move. She sat still, her teacup balanced in her hands, and let the sound wash over her. Another series of bangs, louder this time. "Mom, please. I didn't mean it. You know I didn't mean it." Clara's voice cracked. "It was just the heat of the moment. Daniel was angry, I was stressed. You know how things get. Please don't do this to me." Tears blurred Margaret's vision, but she blinked them away. She would not open the door. The knocking went on. 10 minutes. 15. Then a pause, followed by more calls to her phone. Each one lit up the screen, Clara calling. By the end of the day, the missed call list reached dozens. 77 in total. Margaret walked from room to room, listening to the storm outside her door. Sometimes Clara shouted, sometimes she wept. Once, her voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "Mom, you can't just erase me. I'm your daughter. I'm your blood." Margaret leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. She wanted to fling the door open, to wrap her arms around Clara, to say that all was forgiven. But then she remembered the cake crashing to the ground, her daughter's eyes hard as stone, her voice cold. "We don't need you anymore." Love, Margaret thought, is not supposed to feel like begging. Inside, the air was calm. Outside, Clara's sobs echoed down the street. At one point, Margaret saw through the curtain that Daniel stood behind her, arms crossed, glaring at the closed door. He didn't knock, didn't plead, just glared as if daring Margaret to yield. That glare steeled her resolve even more. By late evening, the knocking stopped. Clara's car door slammed, the engine roared, and the street fell silent again. Margaret returned to her chair by the window. The sky had turned deep blue, the first stars faint against the horizon. She pressed her hand against her chest and whispered to herself, "Strength is silence." The next morning, Adam arrived at her doorstep with a basket of fresh bread and fruit. "Aunt Margaret," he said warmly, "don't let them upset you. You've given more than enough." Margaret smiled faintly. "It's not about revenge," she told him. "It's about dignity. If Clara cannot value me while I'm here, she cannot claim me when I'm gone." Adam nodded, placing the basket on the counter. His steady presence reassured her. For the first time in years, Margaret felt seen, not as a burden, but as a person of worth. Later that day, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Clara, voice thick with tears. "Mom, I can't lose this. Please talk to me. I'll do anything." Margaret closed her eyes, her thumb hovering over the reply button. But she didn't press it. Instead, she set the phone aside and looked out the window, where the candle she had saved now sat on the sill. She lit it again, a small flame glowing against the glass. Each flicker reminded her that even the smallest light can burn steadily against the dark. Clara had made her choice with anger. Margaret had made hers with quiet strength. And now, with every unanswered knock, every ignored call, that strength echoed louder than any words she could ever speak. When night fell, the silence in the house no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like power. The days after Clara's desperate visit were heavy with silence. Margaret carried herself with quiet composure, though her chest still ached with every memory of the slammed door and the cake splattered on cold stone. She had lived through many storms in her life, losing her husband, raising a child alone, working 2 jobs when one was already too much. But this storm felt different. This one had been born in her own home, from the very child she had given everything to. On the 3rd evening, Margaret was setting down a cup of tea when the sound of raised voices reached her from outside. At first, she thought it was the neighbors, but then she heard Clara's name. She drew the curtain back, just enough to see Clara and Daniel standing on the sidewalk, arguing furiously. "You ruined everything." Daniel's voice was sharp, his face twisted with rage. He jabbed his finger at Clara. "Do you realize what you've done? We were supposed to inherit it all, her house, her savings, everything. And now your stupid temper has destroyed it." Clara's voice cracked. "I didn't mean it, Daniel. I was angry, I was." "You were careless," he cut her off. "You think she'll change her mind now? After you threw her cake on the ground and told her she wasn't needed? No. She's done with you, Clara. And now we have nothing." Margaret's heart clenched, not from pity, but from clarity. For years she had wondered why Clara's warmth had faded, why her calls grew shorter, her visits fewer. And here, laid bare in the middle of the street, was the answer: greed. Clara had been taught by her husband to look at her mother not as family, but as a bank. Margaret let the curtain fall back. Her hands trembled, but she did not cry. The truth was bitter, yes, but it was also freeing. She wasn't losing a daughter's love. She had lost it long ago. The next morning, Adam came by with groceries. He found Margaret in the kitchen, her face calm but weary. "I saw Clara's car outside last night," he said carefully. "Did she bother you again?" Margaret shook her head. "Not bother. Just words. But words reveal more than people think." She smiled faintly. "She showed me who she has become. And I finally believe her." Adam placed a hand on hers. "You have me, Aunt Margaret. Always. Not for what you have, but for who you are." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were gentle tears, the kind that cleanse rather than wound. She realized then that love didn't always come from where you expected. Sometimes it came from those who chose you, not those who were bound to you by blood. Later that week, Clara returned. This time she didn't bang or scream. She stood on the porch with a bouquet of flowers in her hands, her face pale and tired. Margaret opened the curtain and looked at her through the glass. Their eyes met. Clara mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." Margaret didn't move. She watched, silent and steady, until Clara finally placed the flowers on the step and walked back to her car. Daniel followed behind her, muttering under his breath. They drove away, leaving the flowers behind. Margaret stepped outside after they left. The bouquet lay neatly tied, bright petals trembling in the breeze. She bent, picked it up, and carried it inside. She didn't throw it away. She placed it in a vase, watered it, and set it on the table. The flowers were beautiful, but they were also fragile, destined to wither in days. To Margaret, they were a perfect symbol of Clara's apology, bright on the surface, but already dying at the root. The final twist of truth struck her then. Love without respect is no love at all. Clara had thought she could wound her and still return to take what was hers. But respect cannot be bought with tears or flowers. It is earned through years of care, and Clara had traded hers for comfort and greed. That night, Margaret wrote a letter and sealed it in an envelope for her lawyer. It wasn't cruel, just firm. Her decision was final. Everything would go to Adam. She signed it, her handwriting steady, and placed it in her drawer. When she turned off the lights and walked through the house, she felt something she hadn't in years, peace. The walls no longer echoed with the ache of rejection. Instead, they carried the quiet dignity of a woman who had chosen herself after a lifetime of giving to others. The next morning, she woke to sunlight streaming through her curtains. She brewed her tea, sliced bread, and set the table for one. Her heart was lighter, her shoulders less heavy. She thought of Adam, of the steady way he had stood by her, and she smiled. Clara might have lost everything she expected, but Margaret had gained something greater, freedom. She was no longer chained to the desperate hope of being loved by someone who did not value her. When Adam visited again that afternoon, Margaret walked with him through the garden, pointing out the flowers that had just begun to bloom. Her laughter, soft and genuine, floated into the air. The chapter of Clara's betrayal had closed. And in its place, a new one had opened, one where Margaret lived not in sorrow, but in strength. Some doors, once slammed, never open again. And Margaret had finally learned that sometimes that is a blessing.